Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you all for joining. This is a webinar from the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care. Specifically, this is a joint webinar with the Migration, Mobility and Care Workers and the Social Care Reform in England interest groups. Adelina Comas-Herrera is the director of the observatory, but she couldn't make it today, unfortunately. My name is Naz, and I will be the presenting the GOLTC to you guys today, and I work as a research coordinator. So, what is the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care? The GOLTC is a platform for cross-national learning. It's designed to improve and strengthen care systems globally. Our goal is to identify shared key challenges and showcase how different countries and communities are addressing them. This is an open space for anyone interested in long-term care, including policymakers, industry members, academics, care professionals, to share knowledge and foster collaboration. So, how do we make this happen? The GOLTC thrives on the willingness of its members to share knowledge and experiences. So we share publications, build country profiles, host blogs and guides on key topics and methods. But at the heart of the GOLTC are our interest groups. So these groups organize webinars, share resources, and collaborate on issues that matter most to them. And we have a large variety of interest groups that all members are encouraged to join, steer, or consider making their own. And it's a space for learning, connecting, and driving change together. So, to show you a couple of our upcoming webinars and the large variety of our interest groups, on Thursday, the 11th of June, we have the Australian Long-Term Care Interest Group webinar. On the 15th of June, we've got another one from the Migration, Mobility and Care Workers Interest Group. On the 23rd of June, we have one from the Pain and Care Homes Interest Group. And I believe on the 29th of June, we have the part 2 from our Global Perinatal Mental Health Interest Group. And on the 7th of July, we have one from the Quasi-Experimental Methods Interest Group. And on the 13th of July, before we take our break for the summer, we have one from the Innovation and Long-Term Care Interest Group. So I'll leave links in the top below, but enjoy the webinar and I'll pass it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Naz. Welcome, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us today. We're focusing today on the international workforce coming through the visa route into social care. So hopefully you can see those slides. Give me a shout if not. As Naz explained, it's a joint session between two of the Global Observatory's special interest groups. I'm part of the Social Care Reform in England group. I'm a professor at the University of Birmingham, researching social care, and I'm particularly interested in system change and system transformation. And it's the reason that I particularly got interested in this topic was through researching home care transformation in a local authority. And as part of looking at their plans to develop a new approach to home care, realizing that over the period of this transformation, 50% of the workers in home care had come through the visa route. And actually, we cannot understand system change and reform in social care without understanding the enormous contribution that the migrant care workers have made to system sustainability, and without also thinking what this means for kind of people's lives, people coming through the visa route, their families, and that kind of broader impact. So that's why we're teamed up with the Migration Mobility group for this webinar. So we're going to start off, I'm going to hand over to Isabel Schutz. So Isabel's going to tell us some of the kind of, give us a bit of kind of research context briefly, as well as from the LSE. Then we'll hear from Patricia Chinyoka, who's the founding director of Women of Zimbabwe, to hear about the experiences of some migrant care workers. We'll then hear from Lucy McDonald and Kieran Broadbent. Lucy's from Skills for Care, Kieran's from West Midlands Care Association. That's particularly about kind of regional forms of support for workers and for employers. And then we'll hear from Suzanne Westhead, who's ADES's workforce co-lead nationally, to hear about what the sort of system change and the system kind of pressures and system sustainability issues relating to the migrant workforce. So lots to do, lots to hear from, and there'll be time for discussion afterwards, and you can put questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll pick up those after we've heard from our speakers. So I'm going to hand over now then to Isabel. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. So I'm just going to say a very few words regarding the context for our webinar today. So my background is very much in the realm of migration and looking at the intersections between immigration policy and care policy. So just to situate what we're focusing on today in terms of the broader context in which we look at migration in relation to social care. Catherine, you able, who's changed? Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, not sure who's changing the slides. So we're focusing very much on, if you like, the past few years with respect to international migration and the care workforce in the UK context. And that involves the recruitment of people to come and work in the UK care sector who came on this health and care worker visa, which was a visa through the UK immigration system towards skilled migrant workers. And that care visa was opened up to care workers in 2020, 2022, in a context whereby care workers had previously been pretty much excluded from the UK immigration system. So back in 2005, it was possible to recruit through the work permit system. And that gradually was ended as that became more targeted towards skilled workers. There was then a sort of assumed reliance upon EU migration as a source of so-called low-skilled workers, including care workers. But as I say, generally speaking, care workers have not been part of the picture of the immigration system in the UK context. Next slide. Thank you. So that's in some ways quite surprising because international recruitment has for long been key to the NHS workforce strategy. But when this visa was opened up in, as I say, 2020 and 2022 for care workers, there was a rapid expansion of international recruitments to the social care sector. Care workers from countries such as India, Nigeria, Ghana and Zimbabwe. And indeed, so much so that care workers became the main group of workers being issued work visas to the UK in the year ending March 24. And those recruitment patterns did indeed help to reduce vacancies in the sector, but there were numerous concerns around the exploitation of care workers, the misuse of the visa, and a number of reports suggested that there was insufficient cross-government department collaboration on the introduction of international recruitment to the care sector, including on risks, enforcement and safeguarding for people affected. So since then, there have been a number of changes. Those changes have included increased focus on compliance with immigration requirements, and there has been a move towards revoking the licenses of social care providers, licenses that are required in order to be able to recruit internationally. And that we saw shifting from sort of 2023 onwards. Then in 2024, the immigration policy change towards care workers required an ending of family accompaniment. So care workers were no longer allowed to bring their dependents to the UK. There was then a sort of shift towards prioritising the recruitment of so-called displaced care workers. So people who've been recruited internationally, found for whatever reason that they were not able to work. For example, people were not being offered the hours they'd been promised of work, or indeed people who had been left without work because the licence of their employer had been revoked. And as we saw from 2025, a complete shift with the ending of international recruitment. So in terms of the current situation, existing visa holders are able to remain in the UK and in principle renew their visas. But there have been ongoing broader shifts in policy, including restricting the settlement of existing care workers and other people on temporary visas, to the extent that existing visa holders may potentially have to wait 10 or even 15 years before they're able to get permanent residence or settlement within the UK. And of course, this raises the question of the extent to which there are significant tensions with the adult social care workforce strategy, which was put in place in England in 2024. That strategy notes the extent to which the sector relies upon international recruitment, albeit alongside the needs to increase efforts to expand domestic recruitments. So just to highlight a few issues very briefly that research has brought to the fore in terms of this context. So there have been a number of studies that have, including my own research, which has pointed to unethical recruitment practices in the sector and the extent to which unethical recruitment may actually be exacerbated by the sponsorship model in place, whereby workers are tied to their employer through the visa. The ways in which penalising care workers through by removing the ability for workers to have dependents join them, essentially separates mainly racialised women from their families. And research that's indicated the extent to which, despite efforts to increase the rematching of so-called displaced workers, that's had limited effect. Of course, there are issues around the extent to which the costs of sponsorship and the need to align pay rates may be deterring visa renewal or indeed re-recruitment of displaced workers within the UK. Bigger issues around the extent to which resources that currently invested in establishing international recruitment, of course, are being put to waste, given that the visa has now been closed. And of course, the big issue being that whilst the government promises to put in place fair pay agreements that will enable domestic recruitments to expand, of course, funding and support for this is not yet in place. So with that, I'll hand over to our other speakers for today. But just to say, essentially, we were motivated to have this webinar to really hear from people about what are the kind of current challenges everyone is facing, both from a provider perspective in terms of recruitment, but also with respect to care workers and the ways in which, in a sense, current changes are very much penalising existing international care workers in the system.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Isabel, for that really helpful context setting session. So we'll hand over now to Patricia. So Patricia, as I said, founding director of Women of Zimbabwe, and I think Patricia will really sort of give us a sense of kind of some of the experiences of people who've come through this visa route. So Patricia, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I was just trying to unmute myself. So Women of Zimbabwe is a broader organization that sits under a care for someone. And Women of Zimbabwe was launched in 2020 during COVID to mainly work around two projects, one based in Zimbabwe around gender equality, women's rights and safety. And in the UK, at the time, we were supporting refugee communities, that's women that came through the refugee cycle, and also mentoring those that were ready to work in the UK. And in 2023, we encountered our first visa application challenge for a single mother that had approached us for some support. And the issue was around her demonstrating sole responsibility because her two children bore the surname of their father. Second slide, please. And following on from that, we put a call out into the community because we wanted to hear more about what was happening to care workers, particularly those that were either single mothers or single fathers. And what we learned was that parents were caught between duty and distance. So for all of the care workers that had arrived before the 11th of March 2024 visa rule changes, they were still able to bring their dependents into the UK, and they are still able to do that. But some of them had been fortunate enough to have their dependents join them, but there were others that were experiencing barriers, and those were keeping their families apart and are still facing barriers 3 to 4 years on since arriving in the country. And some of those key barriers were around the home office challenge. And this is where we learned that there are inconsistent decision making with regard to the visa applications. For example, a mom can be approved for her children to join her on the same reason that another mom is refused. So we found that really confusing. There's also a failure on the Home Office part to apply their own guidance to sole responsibility, and the majority of refusals are based around that the parents or the mothers are unable to demonstrate sole responsibility, which they often do and go over and beyond the requirements of the Home Office. We also learned through a piece of research that we did back in 2024, which was launched in 2025, and I'll speak on it a bit later on the last slide, is that there were harmful levels of cultural illiteracy. And by that, I mean for every mother that bears the surname of the father on the child's birth certificate, they are denied and required to produce sole custody. And the majority of the mothers and a few fathers are able to prove that they have sole custody of their children. And we found or discovered that it was actually a discriminatory practice towards single mothers. So if a mom is in a relationship or is married, they're able to bring their dependents without any problems. But if you're a single mother, there are huge challenges doing so. The other thing that we learned around the family separation, which has already been touched on by Isabel around the visa restrictions, is that majority of the workers are dependent on their employers, and the employers can be exploitative. So they can't move, they can't leave that employer, they are stuck to that employer for the duration of that visa. We also learned through a research that was done by Tulia and launched this year that since March 2024, migrant workers arriving in the UK have been banned from bringing their dependents, and that is having a real issue. Some of those are aware when they apply for the jobs, and also when they come into the country that they can't bring their dependents. And there's a lot of movement. Some care workers are leaving the country. But I think what is quite shocking is that there's an estimated 120,000 family members who would have joined their families here in the UK since 2023, but are now shut out. There are also other issues that have come up as a result of all these barriers that they are facing, mental health toll that the mothers and children and mothers who are working here, they are depressed and anxious, wondering what they can do to bring their dependents, particularly those who arrived before 11th March 2024, because they still have the right to bring their dependents to the UK. There's also the salary requirement. Most of them are earning 25,000. Next slide, please. And here I'm just illustrating more around the impact on the workers and the UK children and caregivers in home countries. And through our own research that we did back in 2025, we heard some harrowing stories about a few of the care workers considering committing suicide because of that separation. There's also the financial strain. They're having to upkeep themselves in the UK and also supporting their families back home. And some of them have told us that they had to pay agents a lot of money to come into the country. There's the timed out reunification where children are turning or have turned 18 during the visa application process. Some started when their children were 16 years old. It's taken 2 years. And the moment that they turn 18, the Home Office says they are adults, therefore they cannot come as their dependents. There's the caregiver exhaustion back in their home countries. Family members who are supposed to look after children for 6 months are having to look after children 3 years to 4 years on. Next slide, please. And these are some of the recommendations that we expected and gave to the Home Office. So we met with the Minister for the Home Office in the House of Lords back in February 2025. We presented the report. We also presented the recommendations. They were very positive, and that they were going to support and work with us. Unfortunately, by July 2025, the rhetoric around immigration had changed. So it's been very hard for us to keep engaging the Home Office to fulfill some of the things that they said they were going to do to support the care workers, particularly, again, I'm going to reference those that have the right to bring their children. We are currently collaborating with the Centre for Care, University of Sheffield, around a project on the timed up reunification, because we feel that the Home Office should be able to do something to enable those children to help them come to the country. And the last slide, please. Oh, I think that was the last slide. So I finished on that. I know I've talked through that very quickly, but didn't want to run out of time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And the slides will be available afterwards because there's lots of really useful detail on all of these slides. So, so you will be able to catch up on those afterwards if you didn't get any detail during the talk. But thanks, Patricia. That's a really powerful account of the impact that this is having on people with the kind of ever-changing and punitive changes to the visa regime in terms of limiting what people can do. So we're going to move on then now to hear from Lucy McDonald from Skills for Care and Kieran Broadbent from West Midlands Care Association. And they're particularly, I think, going to be talking about some of the support that's been put in place through providers and regionally to support people coming through the visa route and to try and sort of mitigate some of the problems that we've seen through some of the kind of pressures that people have faced that Isabel and Patricia set out for us. So Lucy, I will hand over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. So I'm Lucy McDonald and I work for Skills for Care, which is the national strategic body for the adult social care workforce. We're a national charity. So I'm just going to whiz you through some of the things that we do, which is around, a lot of it is around workforce data. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so each year we publish a national report, so looking at changes and looking at trends and doing horizon scanning. And as you can see from the graphs, which is all public access on our website, it's very easy to get hold of and really happy to support if anybody wants to have a closer look. You can see since 2021, sort of like since Brexit and since some of the challenges that we had in the sector caused by the pandemic, you can see a really big increase in the number of international recruits, particularly from countries outside the EU. And you can see, as has been sort of discussed by Patricia and by previous speakers, the impact of the changes that our strategy or policy, national policy, has had on the number of international recruits that we've had joining the workforce. The figures at the bottom there show where our care workers from international recruitment are based. I think it's probably anecdotally, I can say that some of our international recruits came over expecting to work in residential care establishments, but actually when they came, those jobs weren't available, and for a lot of people that's meant quite a lot of challenges in finding works in domiciliary care, for example. So they've needed to think about transport issues and so on, and often driving and having to go through some of the challenges around getting a UK license. The density or the areas where we have most international recruits, I think London, it's about 1 in 5, whereas it's 4% up in northeast Humber. So it's about 4, yeah. So it's a big difference in terms of where our international recruits are being based and where they're working. And you can see that over time we've had far fewer people coming in. Could we have the next slide, please? So just looking at the changes, and obviously before 2020 and before Brexit, we had a lot of European Union workers, care workers and workers in the sector. And obviously the makeup of the sector has changed quite significantly, with a big, significant reduction in the number of EU workers in the care sector, and also a decrease in the number of British nationals working in our care sector. So we've got some real challenges as we look forward to how we're going to support the sector, and how we're going to make sure that we've got a skilled and diverse workforce that we need to support our people. On the right hand side there, you can see the most recent annual report gives us 24-25, so 25-26 will be coming out in the autumn time. But you can see there's with the biggest group, I think, coming from Nigeria, then India, then Zimbabwe. So that's the sort of the key breakdown of our international recruits across adult social care. Next slide, please. So this is some of the work that we've done in collaboration with partners and with the Department for Health and Social Care. So we worked to develop an international recruitment toolkit to support our employers. And we've got sort of web pages supporting international recruitment, and looking at how to ethically recruit international nurses, what looks good, what makes the best experience for employers and recruits alike. We also have a global majority nursing network for our nurses in social care. And we also collaborated to produce the pastoral care guide for international recruits with the National Care Forum. Next slide, please. And just as an aside, in a lot of sort of funding, there is challenges for employers and international recruits in accessing training. But the Department for Health and Social Care, who offer opportunities to reclaim funding for social care employers, there is access for international recruits, and there's no length of residency time. Anybody who has a national insurance number will be eligible to undertake funding through the Learning and Development Support Scheme. So that's something that's universally open to people working across the sector. Thank you. Next slide, please. And as was mentioned earlier, the sector and our partners in health and right across all of our strategic partners for adult social care delivered a workforce strategy, which was published in July 2024. And two of the key recommendations that we made at that time as a sector was that recognising the vital importance of our international recruits, and to make sure that we were able to provide good support for employers and to recruits, good resources to make sure that there was the right funding and infrastructure in place to support workers, and also to address issues around abuse. And secondly, that there was good ethical recruitment support, and we're still hoping that we're going to get some more support for enabling ourselves and our partners to sort of look at how international recruitment is being supported and regulated, and I think those issues have been highlighted already. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll hand over to Kieran now.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kieran Broadbent. I'm Chief Exec of the West Midlands Care Association. We're one of over 50 local care associations in England who predominantly support and promote the independent care sector. As you can probably tell from what it says on the tin, we cover parts of the West Midlands area, but there tends to be a local care association in most counties and most local authority areas. Lucy asked me along today to talk a little bit about the support that's actually been put in place in all the English regions, actually not just the West Midlands, to actually help workers who've been affected by displacement. So their employers had their sponsorship license revoked and they suddenly find they haven't got a sponsor, they haven't got a job, and they don't know what to do. Here in the West Midlands, we received some funding from the Department of Health and Social Care, as did all the other English regions, and we formed the West Midlands International Recruitment Partnership with the 14 local authorities in this region, with West Midlands ADAS, who actually manage and run the project, and ourselves, and also several other private sector organizations. And together, we're doing what we can to actually support people who have been affected by displacements, usually through no fault of their own. As Lucy said previously, we have had some workers come into the country under false pretenses. They were told there was a job here, but they find out that there wasn't. And then, of course, the Home Office, this intelligence gets back to the Home Office and their employers are investigated, and ultimately their licenses are revoked. And I think it's important to actually sort of put a name to some of these people, because unfortunately it does look like a number, and I'll show you on the next slide. So if we can have the next slide, please. So here's some statistics, and I know it's probably a little bit difficult to read, but since we started the program back in November of 2024, we've had over 4,000 requests for support from individuals who've been affected by displacement. That figure was a couple of weeks ago, and I've actually put these slides together. It goes up every day. We normally get on average about 20 requests per day from people. So the way the system works is when a company has its license revoked, the international workers are informed by the Home Office that the employer can no longer employ you, and they are told to contact their local regional help desk for the West Midlands. That's us. So they contact us, and as you can see from those colours, we get about 20% who we class as out of area. So we can only support individuals who actually live within the West Midlands region. So if, for instance, we get a request for support from someone who lives in London, and we get it a lot, then we have to refer them back to the London Regional Partnership, who will look after their case, and ditto, we do the same thing for all the other regions. But I think what tends to happen is people are desperate, and they will write to all the regions in the hope that one of us can help them. But the way the project has been structured and the way the funding's been structured from the Department of Health is we can only support people within our own region. So for those of you who know the West Midlands, you probably know we're dominated by Birmingham. It's the largest local authority in the whole of Europe. So 3 times the size of any of the nearest largest local authority. So unsurprisingly, the most number of support requests we get are from people who live in Birmingham. As you can see from there, I think it says 20.87%. We also have some strange outliers though, namely Coventry, Wolverhampton and Stoke-on-Trent. Now, they're all sort of fairly large industrial cities, all got roughly about 300,000 people in population, but they've got a much larger number of requests for support than neighbouring comparably sized local authorities. And we have sort of been able to get to the bottom of this, and it sort of turns out that people have been told to live in these locations because they've got good transport links or they're central to the country. It's not because their employer actually is based in one of those localities. they've been told to live there by their employer and might be in another part of the country, and these people have been moved around the country for work, which is terrible. And when their employers ultimately had their license revoked, they're suddenly in somewhere where there's no work for them locally. And we've tried to do our best as the partnership to try and place them. There is a triage system in place. What happens once they're contacted, if they're within region, so they live within the West Midlands, we then identify what local authority they live within, because certain local authorities have what we class as an enhanced offering. So that particular local authority has received some funding from the project and are offering some additional support, be that pastoral, be that trying to do job matching, or sometimes like offering sort of links with the Citizens Advice Bureau, for instance, to try and give them legal support if they need it. There is also a legal helpline in place across the whole region for displaced individuals to access if they feel the nature of their case is more complicated or might need some legal advice. So depending on where
you've got 1 more minute.
Okay, so depending on where they live, so they either go to a local authority or they are triaged to one of the external companies. So everyone who comes through the mailbox gets redirected to a company called My UK Life, who offer online pastoral support, and everyone gets signpost to a company called Lifted, who are trying to match them with another sponsor. So next slide, please. So there's the details of the actual mailbox. So revoke.support, any displaced individuals you might come across who are in the West Midlands, please direct them to us and we'll do what we can to help. And there's the details of the companies who are also trying to help as part of the partnership. Hopefully that's on time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kieran and Lucy. That was a really helpful overview of the picture. I think that Skills for Care website's got all those stats on, so I think people can kind of go and dig into those a bit more if they'd like to. And I think it sounds like the ones for this year will be coming soon, but also really great to hear about all that support that's in place around displaced workers. So our final speaker then is Suzanne Westhead. Suzanne is the Director of Adult Social Care at Bath and North East Somerset, and she's also for ADAS, the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services. She's a workforce co-lead. And so Suzanne's going to talk to us, particularly thinking about sort of system sustainability and from the context of people coming through that migration route. So Suzanne, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So just for people who don't know what ADAS is, it's the Associate Director of Adult Social Services, and we're a members group and a charity. So ADAS represents 153 different directors of adult social care across the country, and that 153 councils have got adult social services in their brief. So we represent all of those. So I'm here today to talk a bit about, from an ADAS point of view, about international recruitment. Now, obviously, international recruitment has played a vital role in sustaining adult social care over the last number of years, since 2020, and really following COVID, staffing was a real issue for adult social services. So it was introduced really to make sure that we could cover the vacancy, and we had a high turnover of workforce at that time. It also really helped the providers maintain a service when demand was great and the domestic workforce was just not sufficient. And it's supported and contributed to the local care markets and systems across, and stabilise the systems across health and social care. The other thing that has really helped is that because it was a much more diverse workforce with different skills, expertise, and cultural experience and backgrounds, it really enriched our workforce. So we were, as an ADAS and as each council, we're really grateful for this opportunity to be able to have international workforce in the same way that the NHS does and still has. And the NHS is still actually recruiting outside of the domestic market. So it was a real shock to us when the decision was made not to support dependents when they come in, and then for the change of law by the Home Office. And the expectation was always that we would grow the domestic market. But the changes were made before the domestic market was put in place. And some of you will have heard about the Fair Pay Agreement, which has the government has consulted on, and they'll be feeding back on the consultation in the summer this year. However, the domestic market hasn't grown at the rate we need it to grow. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. A key issue for us, even now, is about our lack of robust data. So I know that in West Midlands and in North East England, we've seen a higher proportion of international workers. We can also see in the Southwest, where I'm from, that it's actually the big councils that have the majority, the big county councils have the majority of the international workers. And that's due actually to rurality. But if you ask me about the dedicated data that we have for each area, it's much harder to do. Displaced numbers are rising, and which is really worrying for us. So we're seeing care workers who are displaced, and then because the organisations they're working from have lost their licence, and it's not being reviewed. And in some cases, individuals arrive for roles that do not exist, or they have never worked in care before. With changes in the immigration rules and early settlement proposals, some workers are leaving the sector, and they're really fearful for the future as well. We are seeking risks for workers. We're seeing risks for workers around underemployment and visa insecurity. And this, as previous workers and speakers have said, this has led to exploitation of workers and instability as well. And quality and accountability is lacking. So our oversight and our quality assurance is lacking to make sure that those international workers are well supported, well trained, and that they have a future here, the international workers that are here. And the number of sponsor licenses, suspensions and revocations raise important questions about how providers are working with some of these staff as well, and how we can support them in the long with people that are still here. Can we go on to the next slide? So what's happening really in adult social care is that the immigration changes are just narrowing the workforce pipeline for us. And in some areas, in some of the bigger county councils, there are real issues around vacancies growing and people not staying long term because work is becoming too hard and they're covering long hours. And we've got an increase in risk and instability for workers. And we need to continue to support those who are displaced into alternative job opportunities. When people come to us, just like Kieran was talking about, we do support them locally, but it's not always as straightforward as we would like it to be, because not every provider also wants to take on an international worker, because it can often mean a lot more work initially to get them in place. So AIDA's response to the early settlement proposal is to focus on recognition of the workers in the sector now. Sustained employment is so important for those workers and for the sector as well. And the treatment of adult social care workers should be more aligned to those working in and applying their contribution-based reductions in qualifying periods for adult social care. International recruitment in the sector should be balanced with a serious commitment around the Fair Pay Agreement and developing the domestic market, so that we have a seamless approach to that. This has been a challenging time throughout, both for the workers and for the sector. We all need to learn from these lessons, and I've seen many cases which have come to me about workers who've come into this country and have not been well supported and actually have been treated very badly within the workforce. And of course, that's not true. The majority of our providers are, hard-working providers, but in some cases, the situation has been very difficult for some of the international workers. And we need to be transparent and learn from what has happened in this situation, so that in the future, that if we were ever to do international recruitment again on a broad scale that we have done, that we've learned to support those workers that come into the country, and that we can encourage them to stay. We are seeing a lot leave the sector at present. So thank you, everybody. I will have to leave in about 10 minutes. So if there are any questions, you can always ask me when it comes to the start of the questions. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thanks to all our speakers. They've given us, I think, a really broad overview of some of the issues that individual workers are facing, that providers are facing, that regions are facing, and then that the broader social care system nationally and the system sustainability is facing. So I think there's lots of different ways to come at this topic. So we'll move now into time for questions. So we've got until 2:30, because we wanted to make sure there's plenty of time for to get into some of the discussions here, as well as to hear from the speakers. So if you've got a question, please do put your hand up, or you can if you're somewhere where it's difficult to ask a question, you can put a question in the chat as well. So I wonder, perhaps while we're thinking about questions, there's a question I can see from Nina in the chat. Nina, I can see you there. Would you be up for asking your question?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the wonderful presentations, if heartbreaking presentations. So I'm curious from the speakers' perspectives why the Home Office has made the decisions that it has in terms of license revocations, because it seems like the consequences are very severe for both the workers themselves and the sector. And so are there alternatives that could have been chosen to maybe achieve the same intended outcomes, but with less negative consequences? And if there were alternatives, why was this choice made?
Thank you. I wonder if, Suzanne, I know you've got to shoot off.
Yes.
If you do have any thoughts on that one?
So the first point I have to make is that I felt that the Home Office made those decisions without talking to the sector. So they didn't talk to the providers, they didn't talk to the local authorities. Like, we're thinking about this because we're really concerned about some of the international workers that have come into the country, that they are not being well supported. And actually, we've seen a number of safeguarding referrals into councils as well. But they didn't talk to us. They just actually straight away made that decision that they felt this was the right thing to do, to stop the pipeline. That then meant that people who should have been supported weren't being able to support it. There was no pastoral care given to many of those people that came in from international recruitment, in the same way that is given actually with the NHS. The NHS supports, accommodates, gives really good pastoral care, and that's had really good results. But I felt like we brought in all of those workers with very little around them, and then when it went wrong, the government decided to stop it. With no consultation. There was very little and no consultation with ADAS, or consultation with local authorities or the providers about, could we adapt this and change it and improve it? They saw a problem, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, I can say is that they made the decision then just to close the pipeline, and they didn't consider those international workers or their families at that stage. Which is a real shame. So I do feel there's some learning to be had by the Home Office on this. And when we tried to negotiate with them, they weren't really up for negotiation. They'd made their decision without consultation. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Suzanne. Lucy, I wonder if you've got any kind of perspective on the kind of whether the Home Office could have done things differently, perhaps specifically around the kind of how the licensing works. And if any of the other speakers want to come in as well, do put your hand up.
Yeah, I just put something in the chat that, and it's anecdotal, but I do understand that the Home Office inspectors, there is no space like with other inspectors that we have in social care, like with the CQC, the Care Quality Commission. If there are problems with the provider, there is like a plan put in place, and this is like these things need addressing. But with this, any shortcoming whatsoever results in a revocation. So, and I'm aware in the Midlands that sponsors who've received really good feedback in the past from the Home Office inspections, they have subsequently been, they've had their licenses revoked. So there isn't any space or any room for addressing problems, which often actually with a lot of providers, these are things that aren't intentional. There's a slight underpayment, and it doesn't have to be, it could be pennies, but still that triggers the revocation. So I'm not saying that's always appropriate, and sometimes actually, some people aren't, shouldn't be sponsors. However, a lot of the time, any lack of understanding or lack of awareness in how the rules need to be interpreted, and that's it. So, with the best will in the world, there's no way back.
Yeah, thank you. And Kieran, can I bring you in on this question as well?
Yeah, no, indeed. Yes, as Lucy said, there's no wiggle room at all. Even if a good provider can make a mistake and find that mistake and correct it, but the way the legislation is drafted at the moment, then the Home Office can just revoke the license. They've got no choice to do it. But I think also a lot of the problems we have particularly go back to when we had this initial spike in overseas recruitment. It was not fought out by the government at all. There was no due diligence done. I mean, it was sort of absolutely staggering that anybody could apply for a license. You didn't have to be CQC registered to effectively import foreign workers. It was horrific. And so it's no wonder, there were bad actors out there looking for an opportunity to make money and to exploit people. And that's what happened. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that. It was probably 6 months in when they closed that loophole to say, if you want to if you're in the care sector now and you want to apply for a license, you've got to be CQC registered. The fact it wasn't in there from the start is absolutely breathtaking. It really is. So it's a classic case of we had a problem as a country. There was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to try and fix it. I think international recruitment was always going to be a sticking plaster, but because it wasn't thought out, it's actually caused consequences which I think could have been foreseen. But I think we should also never forget as well that international recruitment has had a massive positive effect on the care sector as well. When I talk to my members, if you talk about international recruitment, yes, there are some issues, but everybody absolutely waxes lyrical about the staff that they've got, and so it says how brilliant they are and how wonderful their work ethic is. So we shouldn't forget that international recruitment has also been very positive for the care sector. But yes, the problems we've got, I think, were basically of the government's own making.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. And Maka, I want to go to you, and now Patricia, you've got your hand up, so I'll come back to you as well.
Hello, good afternoon. Really lovely presentation, and I learned a lot in just this, less than an hour. I just wanted to point out, when I saw the statistics of, the foreign workers that came in, Nigeria making about 26%, to say that I was part of that 26. I'm now back home. I spent 3 years, on the visa, and I experienced the worst part of the flawed certificate of sponsorship system. So I'm back home in Nigeria now, but still actively following and advocating because my colleagues are still trapped. They're still going through horrific experiences. And I also wanted to mention that some of the reports I'm reading, from the providers' perspectives, I eventually learned that some of them were set up to fail in the sense that they were not prepared. They didn't have the large recruitment budgets that, the big providers had. So they essentially were immigration, officers, and all that. And they couldn't cope. Yes, they were good actors, but they were also bad actors that exploited that and then ultimately exploited their staff. I experienced that as well. So it's interesting. And they have doubled down. They haven't reduced. It's getting worse because they know how, this landscape is very, very uncertain now. So the exploitation has just doubled, which is going to make life, difficult for those that are there. And another thing I wanted to mention, I say this all the time, care work has historically been devalued, or misdefined. And again, part of what I learned was the Migration Advisory Committee. They ranked it as socially high value, but low skilled because of, the education, I think, requirements they need, the qualifications you need. And if that is not addressed, I don't think even domestic workers are not going to be interested. So there has to be a way of reevaluating or revaluing social care. I think skills for care can come into this because it's a different ballgame entirely. You can't be comparing care work with construction. It doesn't make any sense. So for recruitment and retention initiatives, especially for local domestic workers and Gen Z, that needs to be addressed. It needs to be revalued and placed in a different category all by itself. It is very key. So I just wanted to mention that because it's part of why I feel once it's low skilled, low wage, nobody's want to go to, want to work in care. It's not going to happen. And I think the last point I wanted to make, sorry, I just noted some things down. A lot of us that are back home are now encouraging our colleagues to come back because some people are asking me, what do I do? I'm trapped. I don't want to go back. I don't have anything to go back to. The landscape is not changing. 15 years is, we thought 5 years was long. 15 years, if the policy changes, is going to be really bad. So I don't know why things seem to be getting worse, but the ongoing trauma, the well-being, the mental health of care workers currently, both local and international, is a ticking time bomb. It's undiagnosed, I'm sure, because people are still trying to navigate. People are still trying to figure out what is happening. But the earlier that is addressed, the better, because it's like a vulnerable person supporting another vulnerable person. You can imagine the catastrophic outcomes. It's not going to be good for the care workers and the people we support. So it's awesome to be here. I hope a lot of things are addressed, and especially the valuing or revaluing of social care. Thank you.
Thanks, Amaka. That was so rich. It's just lots of things in there. And thanks for sharing your some personal experience as well. I think what you say about skills, that really resonated. Lots of people nodding about that. And I think what you said about well-being, that speaks very much to what we were hearing about from Patricia. And I think your kind of point about the kind of Gen Z workforce, do we really understand how to make care attractive for young people? So that's, internationally and domestically. I think those are things that we need to be much more savvy about if we're going to make for a sustainable system. So thank you for that contribution. And Patricia, did you want to respond? Because I think there's some good points of connection there.
Yes, I do. I think a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said. But one of the things that I think is leading to the revocations is helping in the net migration. Because government wants to reduce migration into the country. It leads to people leaving. So, for example, we've just heard from Amaka, there's a lot of people that are leaving the country and also migrating to other countries. But the last point I wanted to make was around the lack of due diligence on the part of the Home Office with the skilled worker visa. So they should have done a bit more work around how things would work, around training, around supporting the employers, because suddenly a registered nurse can just start their own agency. So something needs to be done, I think, going forward to support them so that there's less license revocations.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. Rika.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everybody for the talk. I mean, the talk is directly relevant to the kind of research that I do. And my thesis is on trying to evaluate the impact of the health and social care worker visa, well, the erasure of it on the health and social care workforce. So it was very interesting to hear everybody's talks. What I wanted to find out a little bit more about, well, there are two questions. The first one is there any kind of information on the proportion of licenses that get revoked over the years, and how has that changed before the policy was, well, before 2020, 2022, when the policy was announced, and then in the years leading up to it, between 2024, when they announced that they would put some additional restrictions, and then 2025 when they completely closed the visa route. And the other question I had was about so we see I've used skills for care data in my own project, and seeing the visuals was very helpful today as well. And as we also Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ghana, India are the predominant migration countries. I can speak for India because that's where I'm from, but I'd like to know maybe from Patricia why you might see a higher trend coming out of Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Ghana compared to other African countries. What is it about these three that make the UK an attractive form of migration and perhaps even remittance sending?
Thanks, Rika. So Patricia, perhaps go to you on that question, then maybe come to Lucy on the patterns around how revocations are changing, and Isabel and Kieran, if you want to feed in, do put your hand up.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. So for Zimbabweans coming across, there's a lot of unemployment in Zimbabwe. So people are attracted to come and work because the majority would have probably been working for a year and a half, and not paid properly back in Zimbabwe. We also have a high rate of Zimbabweans who work within the healthcare sector. So these are doctors, these are nurses. And when the skilled worker visa was introduced, they saw an opportunity to start their own agencies. So there's a high rate of employers from the Zimbabwean community within the UK, and it meant that they went back to Zimbabwe to recruit.
Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you.
And Lucy, in terms of sort of patterns around licenses and revocations?
I'm sure that information is available from the Home Office. I think we have to draw our own conclusions about why it might be that they're being applied perhaps with more rigour. I don't know whether it's taken quite a long time for them to get their inspection sort of process up and running, and it might be that. But I think the climate we're in, I think I would just be speculating, but I know that's all I would want to allude to, really. I think.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
Thank you.
And I can see in the chat there's some quite some useful conversation going on about different elements of all of this. Isabel, I wonder if I can come to you and perhaps around the sort of research agenda here. Thinking about the migration observatory group of kind of where you see as some of the kind of gaps in kind of what do we not perhaps know enough about, what might we want to know more about in relation to this topic?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I suppose one area which seems shocking and also critical going forwards is around regulation. And of course, I mean, it's quite evident that there was, irrespective of whether you've got in principle regulation in place, enforcement has been, should we say, pretty abysmal. And I don't mean just about revocation of licenses, but there's no licensing of recruitment in the UK context. So whereas other sectors where you've got a reliance on migrant workers, such as seasonal employment in agriculture and so on, a system has been put in place to make sure there's a licensing system for recruitment. That's not the case with social care. So even if you say, okay, well, it's only CQC registered providers that can recruit, if they're going through private recruitment agencies that are unlicensed, there's this whole chain of recruitment processes and relationships that are involved. And enforcement of regulation is difficult, not just in social care, but more generally. But I think, given that there's such a long history of international recruitment in the NHS and the opportunity to have in place much better recruitment in the social care sector, it seems critical that we look more at how the enforcement of the regulatory context around international recruitment in social care is is improved significantly, because I think it's unlikely going forward, despite everything that we see happening in terms of immigration and the climate around immigration at present, it seems unlikely going forward that we're not going to see a return to international recruitment in social care, even if we improve domestic recruitments. And there's research that colleagues I was working with some years ago did around, looking at projections around workforce needs and the aging population and so on, that clearly shows that we need both. It's not one or the other. We need international recruitment and we need domestic recruitment to expand significantly in years to come.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. That's really powerful. Any other questions? And Mike, I can see, thanks for that additional comment in the chat. Yeah, Lily, I think that's a really important point around care workers who come through the student visa route. So yeah, although we're focusing particularly today on the health and care work visa, I don't know, Lily, if you wanted to just say anything about that research that you've done.
Hello, sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so apologies. Yeah, I did a really small fellowship project because I also support people seeking asylum, just about their experiences. But they said, first of all, a lot of people hadn't sort of disclosed to their colleagues that was their immigration status, and they just were assumed to be students or on the care work visa. But I think before talking, because they said a lot of their friends were students, for example. So yeah, but working sort of more in the sector, I don't think I obviously hear a lot about the visa, which is really good. But I think yeah, I personally hadn't thought so much about students, but then I do see it a lot. So I think it's interesting, but also I recognise a huge challenge for providers, because, for example, I put a resource together worked with some care providers around employing people who are seeking asylum, who have the right to work, and they, until a recent court judgment, could work in care. Now they can't, and it's just a lot for providers to keep up with. So I do have a lot of sympathy for that, as well as obviously the additional complications compared to the visa route. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's just so many different elements to this, isn't there? There's, yeah, as you say, there's different routes into international workers working in care, and thanks, Lucy, for clarifying that on the stats. I mean, some of the work that we've done around home care work, there's dimensions around, for example, culturally appropriate care. So I'm working on a project with Hironisa and Magella, who are here on the chat, and the sort of how you kind of work towards culturally appropriate care in the context of increased international recruitment, and what kind of becomes easier and what becomes harder in that context. I know colleagues have been looking at and kind of talking about the experiences for home care workers who are going into areas which are very flag heavy, and kind of how, what kind of environment people are increasingly kind of having to go into, and how safe you feel as a home care worker. I think one of the speakers, perhaps it was Lucy, mentioned that quite a lot of people came into the country with a hope of working in care homes, where you're in a set place and you're working with a kind of stable set of other workers who can kind of help you learn the ropes and help you settle in. But actually the demand has often been in home care, where it's you and perhaps one other person going out and about. You've got to travel through areas, you may not drive, you've got to kind of navigate all of that, and then each home, you're never quite sure kind of what you're going to be encountering. So that home care environment is really quite different than the care home setting, and I know for providers, that's and for staff, that's been something that's had to be navigated. So yeah, so many different dimensions here. That's really interesting. And yes, I mean, Richard, thanks for your various comments in the chat. But I think the thing about hours is also really relevant, that sponsored workers have to be salaried, and they have to have reach the required number of hours per week, and that we know that can be tricky in what's often a 0 hours context for care work, and there are kind of issues about how that then intersects with the domestic workforce and kind of balancing hours between the domestic and the international, and whether people are also having to work kind of too many hours. So yeah, I think that's a really good point around hours. Thank you for raising that, Richard. Magella.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine. Thanks everyone for the conversation so far. I wanted to kind of get people's reflections on something I've been thinking about, and it's kind of reflecting back on Amika's point about care work being undervalued within society. And I was really struck in the last year or so when restrictions were introduced on recruitment of care workers and salary thresholds and so on. That at the beginning, the same restrictions were being applied, for example, to the prison service. And the prison service has had a significant increase in the number of international workers in recent years. But the prison service managed to negotiate an exemption from the government, from the new regulations. And it just makes me think about power and the different kind of position of institutions in British society vis-a-vis the government. So it seems, the government is more intense in, or more protective of ensuring the crisis. We hear all the time about the crisis in the prison service, that the crisis in the prison service is alleviated or not exacerbated, but not about care. And I just wonder, especially those colleagues in the seminar who are in roles like directly trying to negotiate with government and institutions, if you've got any thoughts on your feelings of how powerful or lacking in power you are as a care sector vis-a-vis other sectors. Because I think Patricia raised the point that, what's driving a lot of this is anti-immigration discourse, the need for the government to present a fall in net migration. And so it's going to go for easy targets, but some targets, some places where it could go for that is decided not to. So it's just quite interesting politically, I think. And so it says a lot about how care is valued or not within society.
Thanks, Magella. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So yeah, different rules for the prison service and different rules for the NHS as well. So the kind of the NHS are not going to be subject to some of these new more restrictive practices coming in. So I think that is a really interesting thing to ponder in terms of kind of where power lies. Isabel, I'll bring you in, and then Kieran.
I suppose I just wanted to add to what Magella's already said, in that what really strikes me about social care, and what really angers me actually in terms of the ways in which it is devalued and has been horrifically devalued in the settlement proposals, is that care workers are providing a massive public subsidy. They provide a massive public subsidy in terms of doing a job which is fundamentally undervalued and undercosted. And what I get really angered about is when I have these kind of conversations with economist colleagues who, talk about the costs of care workers to the public purse and why they're being targeted in terms of the number of dependents that were given visas, and that, these people are likely to cost more relative to their wages in terms of what they may cost as low-waged workers in terms of benefits, education for their children, etc., etc. But of course, they're only low-waged because of a political decision. And that political decision is not to fund care fundamentally. And, yes, they're not earning 30,000 whatever, but that's because they are essentially providing that money, that contribution to GDP indirectly. And I feel that there's a lot of leverage to be done in thinking about how we actually do bring out that invisible contribution and, bring it into these kind of cost-benefit analyses, which totally ignore essentially that role that care workers are playing in terms of publicly subsidising care. Anyway, it's an ongoing frustration, but I think absolutely how we value and of course that requires political leverage to some extent, but I think much more could be done there.
Absolutely, yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. Thanks, Isabel. I can see Richard in the chat made a point about the fragmentation of the sector, which is of course so true, and the importance of care associations. So Kieran, that links nicely to you.
Yeah, that's actually the point I was going to pick up on Majalla's point about how difficult it is as a sector to actually tell the government what we want. I mean, if you actually sort of look at the sector, I mean, compare it to the NHS, it's actually larger than the NHS, but no one ever seems to remember that. You know, it's 1.7 million people or something like that work in care, but there isn't one monolithic brand we all sit behind. It's 19,000 separate locations, and roughly the same number of businesses. You have, 50 odd local care associations. We very much fight the good fight locally for our members with, talking to local government. But then at the national level, you've got about 12 different national care associations, most of them quite sectoral. So they all have different points of view, different agendas. And so it's actually quite difficult for the sector to sort of say as one voice what it actually wants. And that has sort of held us back, I think. And I think there's also issues about funding as well, because of course, as the way that the sector is funded at the moment, predominantly through local authorities, even though provision is privately managed and owned, it's publicly funded, but you then also get postcode lotteries in different areas, depending on the financial circumstance of that particular local authority. So some care providers are better funded than others through the public purse, and then you've got other areas where there's a massive private funder market who are effectively across subsidizing everybody else. I always call it care's dirty secret. I always think about if they weren't there, the whole sector would just collapse anyway. So unfortunately, there's so many issues. So there isn't an easy solution. I don't think. I wish there was. It would certainly make my job a lot easier if there was. And it is very difficult, I think, to see how care can come together as one voice. We're trying our best within the Care Association Alliance, which is the umbrella organization for the local care associations. We collectively represent over 10,000 care providers. So that's a massive chunk of the market, but it's still not all the market. And of course, the government always wants to talk to one representative body, and that's because we're not public sector funded on the whole, but we're not public sector. We don't have those foot in the doors in government either, compared to the likes of the NHS and the prison service and any other major public body. And that is tricky.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. That's just really important, highlighting that distinctiveness of the sector. And Lucy, I can see you've been putting in the chat some really helpful stats also about the economic contribution of the sector and how vast it is, which is really interesting. Amaka.
Okay, I just want to follow on the lack of unity, as other speakers have said, is heartbreaking. I'm outside now looking in, and I can even see it's, I pointed this out, to a few people. There is the case of me versus you, us versus them, providers versus care workers, providers versus the local authorities. It's quite loud if you pay attention, especially social media. Again, I always attracting and recruitment and retention challenges. For the domestic workforce, the younger generation, they are on social media. So once they see there is no, unity, there's no one voice, which is going to be interesting to see because by nature, the sector is fragmented, different business models. I don't know how that would work, but united we stand, divided we fall. If that's the care sector can get come together, it's going to be interesting. But then there's the advocacy side that I think Richard mentioned. It makes advocacy difficult. I was, because of my own situation, I became part of the Home Care Voices, an upcoming notable, advocacy group for home care workers. But I was also on the advisory board for the Care Workers Charity, So I was quite busy. I was navigating challenges, but I was advocating. And I could see that these are care worker, advocacy bodies that are coming together. I may get into trouble for saying, but there's also lack of unity there because a lot of initiatives are happening with care workers in pockets or in silos, as they say. Again, if the sector can't come together, the care workers can. So if there are initiatives or programs or, interventions, the care workers can at least unite because we're all frustrated. Okay, so that can bring us together. And if there is backing, there is support, there are platforms that can bring care workers together, we can actually, reach out to the public. That's another space that I think is unexplored. The people we support can really speak for us because, yeah, we support them and I'm sure they see what we're going through. I know we cannot afford a massive PR campaign, at Home Care Voices. We wish we had, to be on every national news and the platforms, but addressing the public may get the government's attention, especially since there's lack of unity. So again, it would be nice if there's unity, the care workers can come with one voice, there's more support for grassroots initiatives that are coming up. That's how I'm still connected because I'm, a member of Home Care Voices, and every day I'm seeing care workers cry. It seems nothing is changing, and it's quite painful, to view from, again, outside looking in. So unity is very key, is achievable, I think, I hope. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think that's a nice note for us to end on, really. There's the idea that we kind of might move towards unity. I mean, I think that's my sense that there is quite a lot of kind of almost like sort of falling out within the sector about kind of how we should move forward rather than kind of being able to kind of come up with the kind of shared commitment. I think we can all recognize that there are some kind of villains in the sector. There are unscrupulous employers, there are asset stripping private equity companies. I think probably most people would feel that neither of those kind of have any place in the sector. But outside of that, there is a big, mixed, diverse sector of providers trying to do a decent job. And and I think the more that we can kind of, as you say, speak as one voice to really advocate for the importance of care and the need to kind of have this sort of shared commitment to how it might move forward and how it might get parity of esteem with some of these other services. I think that's just so vital. So we will leave it there for today. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for giving kind of different perspectives on this as an issue. Thank you so much to Naz for hosting and for pulling it together and making it all work. I want to thank Adelina, who isn't here, Comas Herrera from who set up the Global Observatory of Long-Term Care, and she's the host for this organisation, for this webinar. And if you haven't been to their website, there's so many good resources on there. And I think, as Naz said, there's just so many great events coming up. It's just a great platform for learning internationally, because clearly lots of countries are wrestling with the same issues, and we cannot, just try and solve some of these on our own. We've got to use that international learning. So it's a fabulous platform for doing that. So yeah, we will leave it there today. Thanks all. And I think the recording will be made available soon. So if you want to pick up on any of this afterwards, you can do. Thanks all. Bye.